right environment doesn't exist for asking questions. It doesn't matter how good the question is. And in most coaching sessions, I don't think the environment is where it should be. A coach will stop and ask a question, and 2 or 3 highly verbal kids will call out the first answer off the top of their heads. And 8 or 10 of the kids will know that they're not going to answer the question, that they don't have to answer the question. They'll be looking off into the distance and waiting for the whistle to blow again. And so for those kids, it doesn't matter if the question is good or is good or not. If they know they're not going to have to answer it. And even for the kids who are answering it, oftentimes they're answering it because there's this awkward, like coaches asked a question. It's kind of, like someone's got to answer it. I'll just say something, anything out loud so that then coach tells us what the answer is. And so there's a really beautiful video in the book of this coach, James Beeston, doing what I would call managing his means of participation, which he basically, and I think classroom teachers are equally at risk of doing this as coaches. He explains to players how he wants them to answer his questions. And he starts by saying, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions. When you think you know the answer, don't call out. Raise your hand. Because the first thing it does is it allows me to slow players down and to cause them to think for a couple of seconds as opposed to saying the first thing off the top of their heads. And the second thing that then he says, and sometimes I'll call on you if your hand is up, and sometimes I'll call on you if your hand is not up, because the game asks questions of you and you always have to be ready. And so I might cold call you. And if you don't know the answer, just say it and we'll help you get there. That's why we're a team. We'll get there together, but do your best and tell me as much as you understand. And then you see him 15 minutes later in practice, they're working up back through, and he pauses and he asks, he's cold calling players, and everyone is like, they're locked in and they're listening to each other because he's been clear with them about what it means to answer a question and how we're going to answer questions. And I just love framing it in like the game is going to ask questions of you. So that's why I ask questions of you. And so you have to be, when you walk in this rectangle, you have to be ready. And I just don't think enough coaches give enough time to thinking about that. And so like my first goal has to be to make everyone think deeply about the questions that I ask. And then I can make my questions better.
And to have like the psychological safety to be wrong and to probe and to, ask more, I think that's important for kids too, to know that they have that safety.
Psychological safety, I sometimes call it culture of error. I think they're really the same concept, which is, I quote this great John Wooden quote. He describes teaching as knowing the difference between I taught it and they learned it, right? And that's like my challenge as a coach right there. And that's 10 times harder if players are trying to hide their mistakes from me and don't want me to know about them, versus if they're like, hey, so glad I saw that mistake. It's going to help us be better on Saturday. It's going to help us learn to be better players. I'm really glad you, and, or even like, I understand why you played centrally there. And here's an example of positive framing. I love that you want to get directly to the goal, but this is a situation where actually there's a better way to do it. And the reasons why are really fascinating. So let's talk about it for 30 seconds and then I'll give you an opportunity to try it. And that it doesn't blur the line between right and wrong, which I think is how people sometimes interpret this, which is like telling a player, like, here's another way to do it. It's actually saying that's wrong. But of course you thought it was wrong. It's fascinating. That's why people misunderstand, but they're actually, it's such a great topic to discuss. You'll be so happy when you understand why, and it will help us be great. And so I'm so glad you made that mistake. It's going to help me to help you. That kind of language makes it psychologically safe and also maximizes learning, I think.